So it now seems that we know perhaps the majority of the craftworld eldar rules that are going to be in 10th edition. Let's talk through the Aeldari battle host, all the stratagems and enhancements, and a massive amount of datasheets including the mighty avatar of Khaine, the dire Avengers, and some very fearsome high-tech guns. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're doing a bit of an Aeldari roundup, talking through the core rules of their battle host, and a whole ton of datasheets that have been previewed out of the codex. As with 3 other videos on the channel recently, in which we took a look at Demons, Death Guard, and Astra Militarum, we've been getting a whole load of details for new 10th edition rules out of Games Workshop streaming games, a couple of exhibition games at the Kansas City Open tournament, and it seems that Games Workshop gave the commentators free rein to just share a whole bunch of stuff from some of the indexes. Yesterday's one was Astra Militarum vs Eldar. They showcased a huge amount of datasheets, though annoyingly still no points costs yet. But overall, I feel like the rules previews for the Eldar were pretty generous, I think, overall. We literally know all the enhancements and stratagems for their battle host formation, and then we've got datasheets for things like the Avatar of Khaine, 2 of their Phoenix Lords and their aspects, Farseers, Warlocks, Fire Prisms, War Walkers, all manner of Space Elf goodness. Let's talk through the reveals and how the Eldar army is shaping up in 10th. First up, here's the Detachment rule and the Army rule as previewed on Warhammer Community. I feel like just for adding raw power to the army, I feel like Eldar are one of the ones that came off best out of this little combination. Both Strands of Fate and Unparalleled Foresight had a fairly monumental amount of damage to the faction, plus Strands of Fate has lots of other interesting applications. The overall Army rule is Strands of Fate. You roll 12 dice at the start of the game, they basically function like Sisters of Battle miracle dice, and you can plug them into any of the below rolls at will, potentially guaranteeing you a massively important 6 on a wound roll or damage roll if you needed it. There's even some insurance against a particularly bad roll off the drop, as you can sacrifice 1 dice to make a reroll, which I think sometimes will be worth it. And there are at least a fair few rules that they can manipulate this with, as we'll go through, perhaps the most obvious one being Farseer's plugging in an automatic 6 for a unit nearby. So say if you had a big D cannon shooting, you could plug in an automatic 6 even if the dice was a 1 and guarantee that scary amount of mortal wounds. Otherwise, their battle host is their launch detachment. It gives them basically master artisans with a rule called Unparalleled Foresight. This one allows you to reroll 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll each time a unit attacks, perhaps maximally effective on small units with a single reroll, say for example a lone D cannon or a Viper jet bike with a bright lance. Those big rerolls are going to be most value on really high power shots. It's a pretty brutal damage buff across the entire army, and when you can plug in some automatic 6s from time to time, it only gets better. I think a fair few people were maybe questioning if the Eldar will be losing battle focus. Maybe that'll crop up in another detachment along the way. But I feel like the general theme of the detachment is to shift the movement rules onto stratagems and things. It's kind of interesting that out of the battle host detachment, pretty much all the stratagems are in some way movement focus, with a whole ton of powerful options for tricks and shenanigans. The only one that really doesn't tie into the whole theme of movement and tricks is a nice direct damage one called Bladestorm. This one almost seems like a realization of the old Shuriken rule, 1 command point for your units to get 6s to wound, becoming AP-2 better. Despite being called Bladestorm, it isn't actually tied to Shuriken weapons in any way, so it does mean that you could use this to affect scatter lasers, which seems quite good. If there's any Aeldari weapons with the anti-keyword as well, again that'd be very easy to make them AP-2 as it proxies off a critical wound. Overall, I think it's a reasonable enough damage buff. It still does seem best on high volume of fire units against higher save targets, perhaps things like mass scatter lasers on Aeldari jet bikes, perhaps aiming against something tough. Definitely not auto-use every single time a Shuriken type unit shoots, but maybe a nice trick to have if you're fighting against some 2+ saves or something. Next up, and perhaps one of the most powerful out of any of these I think, is Phantasm. Previously this was a pre-game redeployment ability, which was quite good admittedly. Now though, it's another flavour of movement shenanigan, and a very powerful one at that. You use this at the end of your opponent's movement phase, and basically you get to do a little bit of movement of your own. 1 Aeldari unit casually gets to make a move of up to 7 inches, and it's not restricted to anything. It could be anything from wraiths to transports to big stompy vehicles, or of course your standard foot troops. There are a few restrictions. You can't use it on a unit in engagement range, you can't get into a transport, and you can't set up a heroic intervention with it. But even despite all that, I feel like this is a deceptively powerful stratagem that's going to get used a lot. Basically it means that you get to see exactly how your opponent's moved, and that means that you can just move 1 unit so they'll basically never be able to catch up with them that turn. Say you had a great big shooting unit that was out in the open and had just fired at the enemy. The enemy positions themselves to either shoot them back or make a charge on them, just casually move them 7 inches behind line of sight blocking terrain, and for 1 command point you might have saved 1 unit's life. Seems that you could near guarantee that the unit won't be charged unless the opponent's right up next to them, and beyond the obvious of just keeping units safe, there's other options as well. You could just use it for raw extra movement if you don't think your unit's going to get killed. You could be getting into an objective, or even just getting in the opponent's face and charge blocking them later in the turn. Hugely powerful this one, and I feel like it's going to make things a bit of a nightmare for your opponent. They might have to close in on certain Eldar units from all angles if they want to guarantee that they're actually going to be able to strike them. Next up we've got Fame Retreat, which is 1 command point to fall back, shoot and charge. This one's very Eldar and it's been a staple for a while. This one still remains very good, and it basically guarantees that you can't lock Eldar up in combat, they'll just fall back and still be able to do their damage. It does work on really big stuff as well, things like wraiths and vehicles if you want to. Again, a nice flexible one and insurance against getting tagged. Next up we've got Matchless Agility, 1 command point for an auto 6-inch advance. Maybe not quite as much raw power as a few of the others, but I feel like just in terms of practicalities this one's still often going to be worth using. The Eldar do have really quite a lot of assault weapons on their datasheet, so this basically means that you can punch in really quite a long move if it's going to make the difference of getting line of sight on your targets, and if you need something like a 5 or 6 advance roll to make it onto an objective, this could be a way to trade command points for victory points. We still haven't got every single rule in the Eldar Codex, but if there's an advance and charge option that still exists, maybe Howling Banshees, then this will of course be really big for any of those, basically get extra movement in the advance phase before you get to charge something a monstrous amount away from you. Fire and Fade is another Eldar classic. This one's a 2 command point to move at the end of your shooting phase, and now interestingly it looks like it doesn't actually require that unit shot at all, so if you want you can choose to not Fire and Fade I suppose. Between this one and Phantasm, you've got a lot of power for moving things around the board when your opponent would rather you didn't. Again, you could just use this one to shoot a unit and hide behind terrain. Very classic Eldar shenanigans there. Though interestingly, I think that this actually kind of competes with Phantasm now. If you don't have a whole load of command points and the options to have command points for both of these, then you could get the job done better with Phantasm in the opponent's movement phase and even know where they're going to move, provided you're happy with a 7-inch movement. I guess this one does have the advantage of having your actual movement characteristic come up, and lots of Eldar units have say a 12 to 14-inch movement, or you could just use it to get slower units like maybe Wraith Blades stomping up the board just a bit faster, and have them in a more threatening position for your next turn, even if you can't charge after doing this. Still looks good. I feel like at 2 command points it might struggle to compete with Phantasm as much though. Finally, another Eldar classic staple since 8th edition is lightning fast reactions. Use it in the shooting or fight phase for a -1 to hit as they dodge out the way, and Wraith constructs can't use this one. Not really too much to say about this one I guess, other than it's a little bit better against ballistic skill or weapon skill 4+ things compared with 3+. A reactive durability boost is usually quite a good thing if it's going to make the difference between a squad living or dying to either inflict damage or be on an objective. Overall, I feel like the battle hosts are pretty impressive, with yet more decent stratagems to add on to 2 really solid rules. As I mentioned, I feel like Phantasm is going to be an absolute staple and will come up quite a lot, and all of the rest of them seem very powerful in the right situation. Moving on, we've also got the Aeldari Enhancements, the character upgrades for non-epic heroes. Looks like there's 4 of these on offer in the battle host. First up, we've got one called Fate's Messenger. This one allows you to swap a failed save for an automatic 6 once per turn. Pretty much a guaranteed durability boost here, provided your character's ever actually attacked, though I do kind of wonder how much it's really worth investing in. Eldar characters tend to be fairly fragile anyway, and if they really are targeted by anything serious, then I don't think that this is going to save them. I guess maybe might have the potential to save them against a big sniper shot. I think on the durability front, far more interesting is the Phoenix Gem. This one now gives you a 2+ chance to resurrect. Once the bearer's slain, unless you fail that roll, then they get to set up there at the end of the phase. Perhaps particularly good if they die in the fight phase perhaps, as that should guarantee that they get an extra turn to act as part of your army, or even just make their escape. I quite like the way that they combat with 4 wounds remaining as well, means that your opponent will have to do some serious work to put them down the second time. Overall I quite like this one, might be particularly nice on something like an Autarch that's being very aggressive. For the other 2 we've got Reader of Runes. This one's a small boost to your fate dice pool. In each of your command phases, you get to take one of your fate dice and re-roll it should you wish to. I guess the idea is that you might be trying to flip some 1s and 2s into 5s and 6s, fingers crossed. I definitely think that this isn't bad, but maybe just sounds a little bit nicer than it really is. At least a fair bit of the time you're going to be rolling middle results or low results again, but again maybe seems like a nice to have, and any big numbers that you get will have value. Finally, and again playing into their fate dice, we've got the Weeping Stones. This one's another way to farm them. Each time the bearer's unit destroys an enemy unit, you get to roll an extra d6 and add it to your fate dice pool. Again, as with quite a lot of these enhancements, it seems like a nice to have. You would have to commit that to a unit that's going to be a fairly dangerous damage dealer one. Might seem nice enough though on, say, a Farseer with a great big squad of Windriders with a bunch of scatter lasers for tons of anti-infantry, or maybe a jet-bike autarch going on the aggression with these shining spears perhaps. Overall, I feel like they're all pretty usable. In fact, I think the one that I like the most might be the Phoenix Gem. That just feels like it's got a very high chance of actually doing something meaningful, and both of these Fate Dice Manipulation ones seem pretty usable as well. Hopefully get a few more 5s and 6s coming to plug in some big results. Overall, in terms of supporting rules, I feel like the Eldar have done really quite well out of their battle host. Strands of Fate and the big rerolls seem excellent. The stratagems look remarkably frustrating to fight against, particularly Phantasm, and they do appear to have multiple usable enhancements. Datasheets next then, and I thought we'd start off with none other than the avatar of Khaine, and the form-made manifest of the bloody-handed god still cuts an imposing figure on the battlefield. I'd say perhaps compared with a fair few of the Aeldari datasheets, he's not perhaps enormously changed compared with his previous version. I guess Games Workshop were kind of happy with where he was, an enormous great monster that's massively durable and very dangerous, and he does have the epic hero keyword, so no enhancements like that Phoenix Gem for him. That would have been a bit ridiculous to be fair. The avatar's kept his massive defense, 14 wounds at toughness 12, he halves damage still, which is kind of rare in the new 40k rules, and he's still got a 2+ save with a 4+ invul, lots of raw might there. Otherwise his attacks are still very dangerous. His Wailing Doom attacking at range still gets its single shot at strength 16, AP 4 and damage d6 + 2. Looks like the beam rule has been replaced by sustained hits d3. That does seem to have been a bit of a trend throughout plenty of other similar datasheets. Otherwise, he still packs an absolutely massive punch in melee as well, again very similar to how he was before, d6 + 2 damage on those enormous hits, and the option for a fairly punchy sweep mode as well, hitting at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 with a big 12 attacks. Finally, perhaps one of the most interesting tweaks is that he gets a +1 to advance and charge aura, and that does look like it would include him as well, as auras applied to their own models still. That's quite nice there, so it's a little bit of a buff towards getting him towards the enemy, particularly if he's advancing early game and then when trying to make a charge. Overall, like everything else here basically, it will be very points dependent. Will be interesting to see if he does enough for his points to justify himself, particularly as he might often be one of the main targets that's exposed in the army. A lot of other Eldar stuff tends to like to hide. Next up, let's talk through a whole clutch of Eldar vehicles, and starting out we have the Fire Prism. Looks like the standard Eldar grav tanks are going to be 14-inch move, toughness 9 and 12 wounds on the defensive. Looks pretty much as expected, losing a tiny bit of movement there, but they're still very fast, and toughness 9 feels like a fairly proportional increase. That's the same toughness as the Rhino increased to. The Prism cannon is still pretty murderous. Its linked fire is no longer a stratagem that can ignore invulnerable saves and things, but it still punches really hard. 2 shots at strength 18, AP 4 and damage 6, a very reasonable chance to end the life of a vehicle with 12 wounds. This thing has 2 upgrades that make it better than that raw profile though. First up, it has linked fire built into the datasheet as a rule, which means that should you wish to, you can draw a line of sight from another friendly fire prism if there's more than one on the table and the other one is visible to this bearer. It means that in theory you could only have 1 fire prism exposed, 2 others hidden, and both channeling all their damage through the exposed one. Then on top of that, it also has a rule called Crystal Matrix. Each time the model is selected to shoot, you can reroll 1 hit roll and you can reroll 1 wound roll. It's basically a second copy of the Detachment rule, which means that with those 2 shots, even if you fail to hit with both of them, you can reroll them both, and the same for the wounds. Between all that, they're just very likely to be converting. You'd have to fail 2 successive rolls on a 3+ to not pass the damage gate. Due to that, it just looks like these things are going to be absolutely monstrous against big vehicles without an invul save. AP -4 and 6 damage, and a high chance to convert those shots. Otherwise, nothing else too unexpected. It's still got its dispersed pulse mode. That's a bunch of strength 6 damage 2 anti-infantry, and he can't use the linked fire on that. And we've got the new profile for the Shuriken cannon here with sustained hits 1, strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2. Shuriken weapons have lost the extra AP that they used to get on 6s, but they have retained the AP -1 that really quite a lot of small arms lost. Overall, on paper the Fire Prism looks very strong. Seems like the Eldar player in the preview game thought they were strong enough to take more than 1 of, and certainly their raw damage against heavies seems pretty scary from this. Next up, we've got the Eldar Warwalker. These guys give us a look at the rest of the Eldari special weapons, a missile launcher at strength 10, AP 2 and damage d6, or trade out for the blast mode at AP -1. The Bright Lance is basically the same as a las cannon at 36 inches, but gets d6 plus 2 damage, not d6 plus 1. Scatter lasers are 6 shots at strength 5, AP 0, and the Star Cannon is 2 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2, still very nice at killing intercessors. For the Eldar Warwalkers, I think they still look pretty interesting. They can scout move 9 inches if you want to get some mid-board positions, though I feel like with fairly long-range weapons, it's perhaps a little bit less relevant than some. I suppose it might mean that they could hide and get the jump on their foe. The base toughness is 6 wounds, a 3+ save, and toughness 6. In theory on paper that should be a very easy profile to deal with, but it looks like someone's upgraded the Warwalker's force fields since 9th edition, and now they've been tuned up all the way to a 4+ invul save, really good against anti-tank, and as if that weren't enough, they've also got -1 to wound as well against ranged attacks. This really makes them a surprisingly tanky little walker. Small arms used to take big chunks out of them, but with -1 to wound they really won't. It now takes 36 heavy bolter hits to down even one of these. That's going to be a crazy amount of focus fire. It still takes 4 of the new improved las cannon hits to bring one of them down. And while they are susceptible to plasma weapons, it's still not very exciting with the -1 to wound and the 4+ invul. You need 12 hits with overcharged plasma weapons to kill one of these on average. Overall looks pretty solid, a fairly durable and fast platform to just mount some raw heavy weapons. Again, solo ones could be pretty interesting with those built-in rerolls I think. Sticking with the big guns, we've got the support weapons, and I feel like the D-Cannon might be one of the most feared Eldar weapons out there. This thing just looks surprisingly powerful given the stats that it's got. They were very nasty in 9th edition, but they still seem very much so in 10th, particularly with Strands of Fate. Each D-Cannon gets D3 shots that can fire out of line of sight, as with now. It's got a ballistic skill of 3+, but with a heavy keyword, so that nullifies the -1 to hit that you usually get for indirect fire. And then they strike at strength 16, AP 4, damage d6 plus 2. Very, very fearsome anti-tank, but perhaps more so than that, they also have devastating wounds. That means that on a 6, they'll deal d6 plus 2 mortal wounds to the target, and that's just hilariously scary in an army that can give them an automatic 6 to get that devastating wound if one of these happens to be within 12 inches of a Farseer. Just hit with one of these attacks on a 3+, potentially re-rolling with your detachment rule, plug in an automatic 6, and whichever opponent's unit has strayed within 24 inches takes d6 plus 2 mortal wounds, no questions asked. This really does seem fairly monstrous, and even if you aren't throwing Strands of Fate dice at them, it's not like they're bad anti-tank anyway. Definitely look like a pretty spooky unit, and unless they cost a crazy amount of points, they're going to be one of the ones to fear. I feel like the other two are maybe a little bit less exciting. The Vibro Cannon doesn't seem to have any sort of rule to allow you to fire multiples at one target to get benefits anymore. Kind of a shame as that fit with the fluff. Still though fairly generalist at d6 shots at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2. The Shadow Weavers are a longer ranged artillery option, will probably be competing against the tank version once more. They get d6 plus 2 shots at strength 6 and damage 1. They get the blast and devastating wounds keywords. D-cannons do seem pretty scary to me though. Next is the Wave Serpent, kind of similar to the Fire Prism, it's also got toughness 9, it still has more wounds at 13 slightly. Otherwise the Serpent shield has been tweaked a bit, you're no longer only wounded on a 4+, so a small downgrade there, but you do get the 5+ invul against combat attacks now as well. Maybe not the worst considering it's often going to be on the front line delivering units. The turret guns pick up the new twin linked rule for the most part. I feel like that's unfortunately definitely going to be a downgrade for it. I must admit the twin linked rule is a little bit underwhelming compared with just firing 2 of the same gun at the target, and it's perhaps particularly bad for the Aeldari given that they have their built-in rerolls to their detachments. So for example, if you got a twin linked Bright Lance, you would have been rerolling that wound roll anyway. The twin linked rule is completely pointless in the battle host. Hopefully to reflect that it goes down in points a bit, though I suppose we'll see. Finally, for its special rule you have Wave Serpent Shield. Once per game you can cast it against a unit that's within 12 inches, or a 2+ that hit d3 mortal wounds and a battle shock test. Quite a cool little nice to have there. It doesn't actually get rid of your invul save or anything this time. Overall still seems usable, though I think its damage output's going down a lot. I think the Wave Serpent will absolutely love the new transport rules though. Zooming across the board and delivering, say, some dire Avengers or some fire dragons to get some close range shots on the enemy, that sounds quite fun. Next up we've got the Viper jet bike, really quite fast moving, and they were pretty efficient little units in the previous Eldar decks. Perhaps a bit of a rival of the Warwalker this one, trading out the second heavy weapon for some twin shuriken catapults, but getting better movement and losing the invul save. Again, this one mounts the standard Eldar heavy weapons. On paper it should be pretty excellent for a single reroll, maybe with that Bright Lance or the Star Cannon perhaps. Looks like the Viper's special rule is harassment fire. In your shooting phase, you get to choose one of the units that you've shot. That unit will no longer receive the benefit of cover for the rest of that phase, so it might mean that you could use Vypers to dig out units out of cover for the rest of your army to go to town on. Hopefully they're still fairly cheap and expendable, generally useful to have those around, but I think between the single rerolls from Battle Host plus that rule, it seems almost impossible that for a shooty Eldar list you might not want one or two of these. Stripping cover from a key enemy unit seems a very nice option to have in the army. Before we get into the Footdar, so far the only main unit of jet bikes that we've seen previewed are the Windriders. These Guardian mounted bikers are generally a bit of a ranged unit. You can have 3 to 9 of them per unit. Might be a nice one for Bladestorm if they all mount scatter lasers. You could be firing out 54 shots with that. That's going to add up to really quite a lot of 6s for the extra AP there. Otherwise, I feel like they still look solid, provided they haven't gone up too far in points. The defensive profile is fairly nice for Eldar at toughness for 2 wounds with a 3+ save, particularly for moving that fast. Their objective control really isn't bad either, and you could have quite a lot of points on an objective moving very quickly there. Their special rule is Swift Demise. They get to reroll a hit roll of 1 just innately, so that'll buff their damage output there. But that one goes all the way up to flat out rerolling all hits if their target's on an objective. Definitely likely enough, seeing as you want to be fighting over those points, and infantry tend to be the ones that want to claim them. Definitely feel like they have a bit of a niche there, clearing enemy troops holding objectives with their good movement and volume fire. Moving into the Eldar on foot though, and first up we have the Storm Guardians. Really quite nice new snazzy models that I feel like were let down a fair bit by an utterly weak melee profile in 9th edition, and unfortunately that doesn't really seem to have changed too much here. I know they're not exactly going to be the crack assault troops of the army, but I can't help but think that they could have done a little bit better than 2 attacks at strength 3, AP 0, damage 1. If you're fighting anything stronger than Guardsmen or Tyrannid Termagants, it's going to be pretty irrelevant. Beyond that though, Storm Guardians are going to be battle line infantry with the grenades keyword. The Serpent scale platform just gives the entire unit a 5+ imball save now, no other buffs besides that, but still seems reasonable enough. The Storm Guardians retains their 4+ armor save. I think that's not terrible to be honest in the current edition where AP across the board is going down and they're quite light infantry. Otherwise they've got the options for flamers and fusion guns. These just seem to be a melter gun and a flamer but with the assault keyword as well. And it looks like the Storm Guardian special rule is sticky objectives. Nice enough to have I guess, perhaps particularly for ones that are far flung and you think the unit's just going to get gunned straight off. Still though, I think that unless these guys are very cheap indeed, they're looking pretty underwhelming to me. I feel like they're going to be a very tough sell, particularly as you're almost certainly going to have to take a squad of 10 of them still. Next up we've got the Rangers, tending to appear quite a bit as grunt objective grabbers plus a bit of interesting sniping. I do think that their new models are really quite cool as well. Interestingly, despite having been troops in 9th edition, these guys are not battle line and have pretty poor objective control. Looks like the Eldar aren't going to be getting many battle line units bar the Guardians it would seem. Rangers have got the Infiltrators keyword, so that'll mean that they can set up in the midfield, maybe hunker down on some points right from the start of the game and be a bit of a trading piece, and it looks like their defensive prowess no longer keys off cover at all. They just get a flat 5+ imball save at range, and also the stealth keyword for -1 to hit. Despite that, with only a 5+ invul and a 5+ save, small arms are still going to kill them pretty easily. Damage wise, it seems that sniper rifles in Warhammer 40k are going up to damage 2 for most armies. The ranged long rifles hit on 2+ if you're stationary with heavy, or 3+ if you're on the move. Strength 4, AP -1 and damage 2. No more mortals on 6s to wound anymore, but still that's going to have a bit more bite for any saves that actually get failed. With average rolling, you might expect around about 1 failed save from a squad of Rangers rolling against a Space Marine profile. Not terrible, and of course you might spike high. If you really want to assassinate some leaders though, you're probably going to need multiple units. Finally, seems that Rangers bring even more movement frustration compared with regular Aeldari. They've got a rule similar to the Tyrannid Termagants in that they can make a normal move up to d6 inches if the enemy finishes their move near to them. Could be some pretty good fun charge or shooting protection that. Looks like there'll be a unit that'll profit from being near cover, even if it's just to hide behind it when the enemy gets too close. Overall looks kind of interesting. Might be just a unit to have 1 or 2 of though to start infiltrating on the midboard if they're cheap enough. Next up we've got some Ghost Warriors in the Wraithguard. They've got toughness 7 and a save of 2+. These guys are going to feel pretty indomitable against small arms I think, but heavy anti-tank weapons are really not going to have too much of a trouble against that kind of profile. Anything with strength 8 and damage 3 or better is going to go through units very quickly indeed. Looks like they've lost that -1 damage that they had in 9th edition as well. Interestingly enough, it looks like the Wraithguard have dropped their ballistic skill down to a 4+. That's a bit sad there. The weapon options they've got are a Wraith Cannon with devastating wounds. That one hits with a single shot at strength 14, AP 4 and damage D6. I guess devastating wounds again is pretty interesting if you've got a spare 6 or so for a Strands of Fate dice. Turning those into mortals is very nice. Otherwise the D-sides get you D6 shots hitting on a 4 at strength 10, AP 4 and damage 1. Fairly general purpose, maybe just a tiny bit less so than before though now, as they'll be wounding things like toughness 12 vehicles on a 5. Overall they do look like a bit of a weird unit to be honest. I would be a bit worried about whether they'd really have enough durability to hold the mid-board, unless they're perhaps a little bit less expensive than they were before, but I suppose they certainly won't care about small arms. I kind of wonder whether the Spirit Seer might give them a +1 to hit or something. That might seem fairly appropriate to get them back to being a bit more guided. Finally, perhaps one of the more interesting things though about the Wraithguard is that their damage output is kind of split between 2 turns. Their War Construct special rule means that once per battle round, when an enemy unit targets this unit, after that unit's finished attacking them, you then immediately get to make a shooting attack as if it were your shooting phase. When that happens, the weapons also get the pistol ability as well, which means they could fire in combat to full effect. That one's a very interesting and powerful rule. Potentially if someone targets these guys, they could just turn around and just blow up something completely different. They don't even need to return fire against the unit that shot them. I guess that could make them a bit of a problem nuisance unit, particularly if you had a vehicle move up and then the Wraithguard just take a big chunk out of them the first time that you target them. Overall might just be a bit of a unit that is a bit easier to deal with someone who really thinks about what they can do, as opposed to someone who just deals damage to them and leaves a fragile unit exposed for them to kill. Moving on, we've got a fair few aspect warriors. First up, the Dire Avengers. It seems that the boys in blue are retaining their spot in the elite section, at least in the Spiritual Force Organisation chart of 40k, as they don't have battle line, and sadly they've only got one objective control. I kind of thought they might have got objective control too, perhaps. I feel like perhaps these guys are some of the main battle line of the craft world quite often. Otherwise though, looks like their profile's fairly similar. The aspect warriors still retain their 5+ invul save, it would seem. Kind of nice to actually make them at least a little bit survivable, or at least unexpectedly so. And of course the main most exciting thing about these guys is their shuriken catapult fire. Looks like the new profile for the Avengers shuriken catapult is 3 shots hitting at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1, so they have lost a little bit of AP there. They have also traded the shuriken rule for extra AP on 6s to get lethal hits instead. I feel like this one will probably do a fairly similar job of allowing them to punch up against tough stuff just with sheer amounts of blade storm fire. They'll certainly just obliterate a lot of light infantry out there, but hopefully should take a fair chunk out of heavy ones as well, particularly if buffed by things. They definitely do look like a unit that's interesting to use that blade storm on as well. Otherwise the X-Art melee is just nerfed a little bit. Quite a lot of combat weapons in 40k lost AP, and the X-Art looks a bit tamer than it was before. The Power Glaive is also damage 1 rather than damage 2. It looks like the special rule for the Dire Avengers though is all about Overwatch. In 10th edition you can fire Overwatch in the movement phase as well as the charge phase, so it can just be some extra damage against fragile stuff your opponent puts forward. It's going to be a stratagem that comes up an awful lot, and Dire Avengers get a boosted version of it, a 5+ to hit or 4+ if they're on an objective. I feel like this one's going to reward them being fairly brave, maybe jump them out of a Wave Serpent on a midfield objective, light up the opponent in your turn, and then in their turn in the movement phase basically get a second round of shooting as well. Hopefully throw a whole bunch more shurikens against a unit that strays in range. Overall I think it's definitely an interesting profile. Glad to see that they're at least still somewhat general purpose with the lethal hits. We do also have the profile for their Phoenix Lord Asurmen as well. The Phoenix Lords look like they can only join their own aspect warriors, as you'd probably guess, and it's kind of cool to see the new profile for Phoenix Lords for Eldar in 10th. The flavour of them does look like they've changed a bit. They're not going to be going off on their own quite as much, and they're going to be leading units. It does look like they actually meaningfully increased the damage output of their units though, which was a bit sad that they didn't tend to before. Durability wise, they're a bit easier to kill. Looks like the Phoenix Lords lose their damage cap rule where you can only take 3 wounds off them per phase, but Asurmen still keeps his 3+ invul, though he is only toughness 3 now and -1 wound. When his Dire Avenger bodyguard do die, then he's going to be a lot easier to remove from the table. He does have a fairly solid amount of extra personal threat. His shooting with the Bloody Twins is 6 shots at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 2. Extra shurikens for the unit there, and good at killing heavy infantry, and then he strikes in combat with the Sword of Azure. Strength 6, AP 3 and damage 3, solid anti-Terminator type damage there, and devastating wounds again, quite nice with Strands of Fate. The buffs that he gives a Dire Avenger unit look really quite cool though. He gives them +1 to hit, lots more strength 4, AP -1 fire coming that way there. though I guess it wouldn't increase the chance of them getting lethal hits. On top of that though, he also allows the unit to fire Overwatch for free for 0 CP, and he can even do so even if you've already fired Overwatch somewhere else this phase. This one's massively good, I think. Basically means that you can have that extra free volley of Dire Avenger fire, hopefully hitting on a 4. You don't even have to expend a command point to do so, and it doesn't stop you firing Overwatch with something else, which is pretty big as I think it's going to be a stratagem that gets used a whole ton. Overall, I feel like it looks like a very solid boost to the unit, extra damage, better Overwatch, and a little bit of personal melee threat to add to the unit. Next up, we've got the Striking Scorpions. Like the Rangers, these guys have infiltrators, so I guess they might compete a little bit for the forward deployment rule. I feel like the Scorpions are still probably going to be higher investment. I think it is quite fun as well that the Eldar did manage to retain their Exarchs. A fair few other armies now don't have a specific profile for their Sergeant, but the Eldar kept one because they get 2 wounds rather than 1. Kind of nice to retain the mini character vibe, though I guess it's a bit sad that their choice of Exarch powers has gone away. The Striking Scorpions are a fairly dedicated anti-infantry melee unit. They each get 4 attacks at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. I would say that is a bit of a come down compared with their previous. They lost AP -1 and strength 5 from their previous profile. However, it's not all bad news. They still have sustained hits 1, which they kind of did already in the last game, and when they make that big volume of attacks, any 6s will be devastating wounds against everything besides monsters and vehicles. Manda Blasters coming in clutch there. Looks like they'll be fairly threatening at least for clearing out medium and light infantry. I feel like the Exarch weapons are perhaps a little bit better balanced this time round as well. Both the Claw and the Biting Blade look good. I feel like maybe the extra strength and AP of the Claw perhaps slightly win out for me, even if it does cost you an extra attack and a -1 to hit. I'm still maybe not sure they're a unit that I'd go crazy on. Again, maybe a bit of a premium choice to start in the midfield. Could be fairly scary if they make a long charge. We also have the Phoenix Lord of the Scorpions as well, Karandras. His durability profile is kind of similar to Asurmen, though it only has a 4+ invul, not a 3. Karandras' special rules though are just all about adding flat melee damage to a striking Scorpion squad, and they make it quite a different beast if he's around. He gives the unit +1 to hit outright, and he also gives them sustained hits 4+ on the charge, so a 4, 5 and 6 will give them additional hits between those two rules, totaling up to an average of +60% damage over what you'd expect your Scorpions to do normally. He also adds his fairly mighty melee profile himself as well. Strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2, which will go through things like Space Marines very quickly. He's got a sweep mode for dealing with hordes, and he's got a devastating wounds against anything that isn't Titanic, so he can punch up a bit against monsters and vehicles. Still though, even with Karandras around, I feel like you'd struggle to deal with anything that's a big tough vehicle or monster. Even he will be wounding them on a 5+. Lastly, for the aspect warriors that we've seen so far, we also have the Warp Spiders. I think that these guys look pretty interesting with their flicker jump shenanigans. Like the other aspect warriors, their stat line looks fairly similar to how it is now. They still have their 3+ save and 5+ invul. They still have their Exarch. I'll probably lose the cool powers that the Exarch could bring though. A few of the Warp Spider ones were kind of fun. I think the Death Spinners have had an interesting side grade as well. They've got D6 attacks that auto hit now rather than having to roll to hit. They lost both strength and AP that were both quite good before for a fairly measly strength 4 and AP 0, but again, like the Striking Scorpions, they have devastating wounds. Overall, it's an interesting sort of side grade. If you have the Exarch with the second Death Spinner, I guess that means that you'd be averaging a round about 20 hits with them overall. You'd go through light infantry quite fast with that, and you average around about 3 or 4 mortal wounds out of that too. So again, they feel like a unit that's going to take a decent chunk out of most things that they target, even if they don't outright kill them. Otherwise though, I feel like perhaps the most interesting rule is that flicker jump. Often this has been a reactive movement to enemies trying to shoot them. Now though, it seems rather aggressive. In your movement phase, you get to declare a flicker jump once per game. If it does, then you get to increase their movement to a massive 24 inches, and they do have the fly keyword. You roll a dice, and on a 1 they take a mortal wound. Not exactly the worst chance in the world there. You can't charge with a squad, but they can shoot to full effect. That really is quite devastating that you could have the unit just jump in right next to the enemy, potentially just right as close as 1 inch to them. Sort of like a pseudo deep strike that you basically can't really screen. Still doesn't seem like it would necessarily be overpowered or anything to me. Even with a 3+ armor save, they aren't exactly the most durable, and are going to be quite easy to kill back in return, but certainly could amp up an Eldar Alpha Strike of some sort. Could be interesting for hunting down units hunkering down behind terrain as well. You might be able to get some crazy lines of sight with this. Finally, we've just got a couple of previewed characters as well. The Farseer Skyrunner is the jet version of the Farseer. For the most part, it's kind of similar to the one that we'd already seen. It does have that excellent Strands of Fate ability, where basically if you target one unit with them within 12 inches of them, then you get to flip the dice to a 6 and maybe plug in a massive devastating wound attack or similar. Looks like the Skyrunner version of the datasheet can either lead a Warlock Conclave or Windriders, no leading Shining Spears apparently. He gets the Eldritch Storm, the same as the regular on-foot Psyker, to add to his Shuriken Fire. Interestingly though, there does seem to be a bit of a delegation of duties between the foot one and the bike one. The datasheet for the foot Farseer gets Fortune, but this one gets Guide. Target one Aeldari unit within 12 inches of him, roll the dice, and on a 2+, that Aeldari unit gets to re-roll hits. Looks like it's until your next command phase, so it might be usable for Overwatch as well for a really big gun unit. And there's no core restrictions or anything like that this time round. You could be using it on Wraith Knights, batteries of D cannons, or units of Dire Avengers with their cool Overwatch. I'd say that on balance this one feels better than the on-foot Fortune power. It does feel a bit weird to have one arbitrarily locked to the guy on the bike and the one on the guy on foot though, rather than just being able to freely choose the power between the two. I think that this guy's going to be a really popular character, and perhaps Windriders too as a result. Guide's a pretty excellent power, and being able to zoom around the battlefield is also pretty handy. Otherwise, his partner in crime is the Warlock Skyrunner. Looks like he'll be a different datasheet to the Warlock Conclave. I guess that's going to be its own thing now. This guy I suspect will probably only be able to join Windriders, as I guess he'd likely not be able to join a Warlock Conclave, but that still seems decent enough. I kind of wonder if the on-foot Warlocks will get Protect and Jinx, as those powers were rather nice. This one gets Conceal and Reveal though. Both of these only affect the model's own unit though, as opposed to targeting your favourite units like the Farseer. Seems like Conceal could be pretty nice on a big unit of Windriders though, give them stealth and then -1 to hit. Reveal gives the unit Ignores cover as well, which again could be relevant in certain matchups, armies that get it innately, or just in good terrain where the save difference is going to be big against some scatter lasers or some shurikens. Overall feels like he's a bit of an interesting little squad upgrade now more than anything else, and he also chips in a little bit with the damage as well. He fires off a psychic flamer attack called Destructor, a bit of a return of a classic that one, and then you can choose between the Singing Spear and Witchblade for either a bit of a shooting attack or anti-infantry 2+ on his combat. Finally, we've got the other two datasheets revealed, which are the standard Farseer on foot. Again, perhaps the most interesting things about this guy are the differences between him and the Jetseer. He still has Branching Fates and Eldritch Storm. The main different thing that he adds is Fortune, giving a -1 to wound on one Aeldari unit. This one makes them -1 to wound, so it's pretty much a guaranteed strong durability boost there. And to be fair, it could be very nice on particularly tough Eldar units. I guess that would be pretty monstrous on an avatar of Khaine, to be fair. Looks like there's probably place enough for both of them. I suppose he'd likely be running with some Guardians or similar on foot, or a Warlock Conclave. Finally, we also had the datasheet for the Guardian Defenders before, kind of similar to the Storm Guardians, but armed with the 2 shots at Strength 4, AP -1 and Damage 1, again at 18-inch range, and they are assault weapons, so they can keep up a decent movement with that before they fire. The Guardians get their shooting weapon platform with a standard Eldar heavies mounted, and I feel like the Guardian Defenders are just a fair bit more interesting for the Storm Guardians for their special rule as well. At the end of your command phase, you basically generate an additional Fate dice for every single objective with a unit of Guardian Defenders on it. Looks like perhaps one of the main ways of generating more Fate dice throughout the game. I feel like at least one of these units to stand on an objective and just farm those dice seems like a pretty excellent decision to me. I think the Storm Guardians as a result would have to be massively cheaper than these to really get a look in. So anyway, there we have it, really quite a lot of Eldar datasheets there, and though of course we certainly need points to have the full picture, I feel like things are looking up fairly well for the Eldar that we've seen so far. 2 enormous damage dealing faction rules, and plenty of really big sneaky movement tricks that they can use to keep safe. I really like Phantasm and Fire and Fade, and they've got a bunch of pretty interesting datasheets as well for other interesting out of phase actions. I think for strong datasheets, I certainly feel like those D-sides are going to see some play. Even if they do cost a lot of points, the chance for d6+2 mortal wounds just automatically with a fate dice seems absolutely outstanding. I think the Guardian Defenders will be used to sit on a home objective and farm you more fate dice. The Windriders look pretty interesting anti-infantry damage dealers, fast movement, and a whole load of fire that can get some very easy buffs. And things like Vypers and Warwalkers look like they'd be great with the faction rerolls, rerolling those bright lance shots and landing some super accurate anti-tank fire. Same goes for the Fire Prism there, I guess. The Prism Cannon with the 2 sets of single rerolls looks like it's almost ridiculously reliable. Let me know what you make of all the previews though. I'm feeling good about Eldar armies going into 10th edition so far, and feel free to point out any other interesting combos or synergies that I might have missed. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. A massive thank you to Alapala for helping with this one over on the Discord channel. A big thank you for scraping all the datasheets together and catching a couple that I've missed. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page. That's the main reason that I can continue to do this as my main thing and keep the big videos coming as regularly as possible. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.